as we were talking, giving a intimate one-on-one conversation as it relates to the Israeli elections and really where we're going forward. For those listening and trying to give a context to the framework of this entire topic, let me just put out a few ideas and kind of constructs as how the Israeli system works and its uniqueness in general. The Israeli democracy is a parliamentary system. It is comprised of a parliament, which is comprised of 120 seats. And to become a majority party in Israel, one needs at least to have a majority of 61 to actually make the system actually work and take control of the government. Historically speaking, since the state of Israel has come to fruition, the modern state of Israel back in 1948, there has been two major streams, or I would say that comprise the voices, or it's not a two-party system, but it's the two kind of prevailing viewpoints. One is the labor, and which is more of the left, center left, and the other part is the Likud, which is the right side of the political aisle. Again, most of these political parties that are today their origins began in Europe prior to the State of Israel, and the evolution during the foundation of the State of Israel brought about these political parties in general. So what we've seen over the past past few years is a fascinating illustration or excitement of the Israeli democracy. The Israeli premiership, it's important to note, lasts 4 years. Unfortunately, given the delicacy of maintaining the majority itself, unfortunately, none of these governments have lasted or been able to achieve their full 4-year term. In the past 4 years now, and that we've seen the delicacy even going further and further. It's also important to understand and to note that politically speaking, I would argue that since the year 2000, we've seen a political shift in voices and opinions moving on to the center right. It's also important to note, all of us who look at American politics, is that the gap between left and right in Israeli society is much narrower between the gap between left and right, I would say, in American society today. So there is that glue that brings about the ability to create coalitions. Historically speaking, in the past, Israel is now about to celebrate its 75th anniversary. No party has been able to achieve more than 56 seats altogether. And what happens as a result of that is that creates the political bargaining or the bartering or the haggling that goes around, which is more analogous to the bazaar in Tehran than anything else, is trying to create these coalitions to bring them together. So if you look at what we have here, and to kind of give a sense of what happened in 2022, these are the outgoing polls. Now, polls, like any other place, are subjective to who the poll that are given, but these were mostly what the expectations were when polls were taken in July of 2022, what the expectations were. As you can see, if you look at the graph itself, Likud is still the highest, which between about 34. It's 34.7%. Yesh Atid, which is headed by Yair Lapid, is about 21.3%. Then you have an entire slew of smaller parties that comprise this conversation or this dialogue that are going to lead to one party that is going to be the majority party, is going to be able to control the Israeli parliament. This has been the consistent game, the political game, of how this bartering and haggling has taken place in order to create a solid government. What happens is, and this is part of to the detriment of the Israeli political system, is that the smaller parties unfortunately take away from the larger parties. It's also important to note that the threshold of these parties to get officially to become a part of the Knesset, of the Israeli parliament, is currently to date 3.25. And that's an increase of what it's been in the past. And so every time these smaller parties come about, they take over from the larger parties. And unfortunately, what happens is even with 1 or 2 seats, they are able to grab power from the smaller issues. So while the state of Israel is one system, one swatch of a vote, it is a proportional system in general as far as the Israeli parliament goes, those 120 seats in general. But the smaller seats here and these smaller parties are unfortunately take away from the ability to create this kind of larger stability. The players that have looked into this larger agenda that are worth noting, and of course come up again, to my far right is Benjamin Netanyahu. Next to him is Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz, Merav Michaeli. These were the leaders of the top parties, between Likud, Yesh Atid, the Blue and White Party, and the Labor Party. These are the two, historically speaking, been the largest parties, though the labor in Israel has really lost a lot of its power over the past few years. And as I said before, the left in Israel is really not the traditional kind of historical socialist left that came from Europe, no longer exists in Israel of today. I would say that what you see in Israel today is a factor of centrist politics that have shifted over the years. 2000, and the reason I mentioned 2000 as a turning point, because historically speaking, 2000 was also the collapse of the last peace talks between Israelis and the Palestinians. Back in 2000, it was known as Camp David II, and the rise of the Second Intifada, which I would argue has been going on for the past 23 years, this kind of cycle of violence between Israelis and Palestinians. And so that disillusion of the idea of having peace between Israelis and Palestinians have kind of shifted Israelis to focus more on internal issues, but also to be skeptical of what's going to happen in general between Israelis and Palestinians. That being said, they have gone through these cycles of attacks in Gaza, coming into Israel as far as rocket barrage, attacks of rockets, and that has continuously shifted and reinforced the security narrative. So when you kind of poll Israeli society, even if you are living in the center of Israel, and the majority of the state of Israel lives in the coastal part of Israel, and you are more of a central political viewpoint, you understand the need for the Israeli Defense Forces. And so that has also shifted the dynamic in general. The other external factor, putting aside internal Israeli politics, is of course the looming threat of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Though the threat of Iran and the Iranian tentacles have also articulated and basically come to fruition within the Israeli voter in general, as far as what the Israeli voter goes to vote on. Interestingly enough, Israelis are they go to the vote in pretty significant numbers. The last elections now that happened now, this 5th election in 4 years, generated close to 71% of Israeli society went out to vote. Even though it is lower historically than the normal that usually goes in the 80s and 90s, you are seeing a voter fatigue. But Israelis do understand that what's at stake here, and given the fact of how their leadership plays into the decision-making processes about the state of Israel at large. So that's kind of what we've seen here again. Uniquely speaking, which I think is also something part of what Lowell and I have been discussing, and the uniqueness of the infrastructure of this narrative, is the fact that to date, Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister, is the longest sitting prime minister Israel has ever seen, historically speaking. And so again, if we talk about the Israeli democracy in general, Israel has no term limits on premiership, which allows that, structurally speaking, to allow a Benjamin Netanyahu to get elected again and again. Why he gets elected again and again is the interesting part of the equation at large. And I think that that has to do with what Netanyahu has been able to galvanize within Israeli society, within the periphery in particular, and within the what he's been able to do during his past 10 years as premiership. He has grown politically speaking, in the sense that he's been able to, he prides himself, and I think that he deserves credit for that on a variety of levels, as far as the new change Middle East reality vis-a-vis the normalization with new Arab states under the Abraham Accords. That again has created stability. What that has also done within the Israeli societal understanding of Benjamin Netanyahu is also taken the focus off of the Palestinian case study. That is to say that, historically speaking, and something that I have delved into and written about over the years, the centrality of Arab politics, and in general, and especially the countries that have been around the state of Israel, have been focused on the Palestinian front. That is to say, and this has actually been a part of the blueprint of the PLO back in the 60s and all the way until it transformed itself in the 90s into the Palestinian Authority, is that nothing should happen in the region without dealing with the Palestinian issue first. That is to say that the Palestinian issue needs to be resolved first for anything else to happen in the region. That is also to say that based on the concept, what was known is the package deal of the PLO, or the three no's of Khartoum: no negotiations, no peace, and no compromise with Israel until there is a resolution for the Palestinian matter. That started to break down after 1979, when Israel and Egypt came together and had peace. So that modality of the package deal, so to speak, the political package deal, has began to crack. And so then we saw it again in 1994 when Israel started peace and formalized the relationship with the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And now, under the Abraham Accords, you see an entire new swatch of countries in the Gulf, from Bahrain to the UAE to places in North Africa, as far as Sudan and Morocco. Now, part of what is being discussed, or what Netanyahu is ran on that campaign, is working on normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia. These are the kinds of phenomenal things that are creating a slew of encouragement and excitement amongst the Israeli population, is that they, because of these newfound relationships and how well they are helping Israel economically. And so there is the economic factor that's playing out here. And on the security factor, as when it comes to existential threats in general, and the number one existential threat for Israel that is agreed upon, I would say, amongst the majority of Israelis across the board, is the fact that Iran represents the largest destabilizing factor for Israeli society. Given the fact that Iranian tentacles are associated with Hamas and Hezbollah, being the south and the northern part. And so Israeli society is quite aware of that. And so that in itself is also giving them hope within a Benjamin Netanyahu. So I mention all of that is because when you poll Israeli society about some of these matters, the security aspect gets through as something that can be achieved. But I will also say that as a result of the fact that these are considered to be consensus issues, Netanyahu's predecessors have also focused on security. So again, it's not all rooted in Benjamin Netanyahu. It's the fact that security matters have always been a major concern in Israeli society, but what he's able to do in an economic front is really to normalize relations. That has changed the dynamic itself. Netanyahu prides himself that the Abraham Accords that were signed here in Washington under the Trump administration were done only because of him. That's part of been his political messaging that has gone all around. But when you look at, really, I would say this bizarre, crazy, unorthodox fluidity and volume of elections really started back in 2018, and that led to these series of elections since 2019 that led us to this environment that we are now in 2023. And so these are part of what we saw happening back in 2019, where you have, again, 40 political parties, 120 members of Knesset, the threshold that goes through all this. Again, this was back in 2018, 2019. And so these are part of what we saw here that played out within to make this entire configuration happen. Back then. Again, it's still true to where they are. What has happened since 2018, 2019, is that the party, this party of the blue and white, which was a significant party that had was expected to get between 26 and 28 seats, no longer has that power today. So again, there's an ongoing fluidity of changes, while at the same time, Likud, the party that Netanyahu heads, has been consistently between the high 20s, low 30s on a consistent level, which, if you do the math, which is part of this experiment that comes up again and again, you continuously come up with the same results, which allow Netanyahu to get control. Now, it's also important to note that in contrast to the environment here, Israelis vote for their party. And so when they vote for a party, the head of that party is the party that becomes, most likely to become the leader of the party and becomes the premier. And so that is what has happened when continuously people continue to vote for Likud. Even though there has been constant attempts to try to, under the Likud primaries and whatnot, to try to dethrone Netanyahu, every time that has happened, he's still been able to pull out another rabbit and make the magic happen. But in May of 2020, what you see here has happened. Again, you can see, how this game has played out on this pendulum. Is again, the Likud is still in the 30s. You have the religious right, and then you have, that has been politically aligned with Benjamin Netanyahu, and then the rest. And this is really this is a critical part to understand how this block has been created. The trust amongst the political trust, as much as one can find any kind of political trust within the right and within the religious parties, has allowed them to believe that Netanyahu is easier, that will fulfill or maintain their stability, in contrast to parties that have more of an anti-religious slant to them. And so as a result of that block, the religious parties, including Shas, United Torah Judaism, and Yamina as a party, have latched onto Netanyahu's ideology. Ironically speaking, I would argue that Netanyahu is the most liberal voice within his current coalition. I mean, that's how the political kind of spectrum has played out here, left and right. But what these recent elections have done, and I think that is a critical part to understand as we try to dissect the Israeli societal, social politics, it is, of course, an issue that has been a cornerstone of I think Israeli politics in general, and that is the religiosity. Those of us listening in the audience online to understand that there is no separation of synagogue or church and state inside of Israel. The religious parties in general have a significant amount of power, and they also have a monopoly over all cycle of life issues in Israel when it comes to religious matters: divorce, marriage, burial, citizenship itself in the state of Israel goes to the questioning of defining who is a Jew. These are all these parties that have so they're able to weigh in on one's Jewishness. and who determines that? And that is based on the Israeli rabbinate, which is the rabbinical authority, which are political appointees. And so one needs to understand when you're trying to dissect this dynamic that what you're seeing today inside of Israel is also a friction and a tension between secular Israelis and religious Israelis. And the fact that these parties are now part of the Netanyahu coalition and are trying to impose or trying to project or trying to insert their lifestyle and the matters of religiosity into the totality of the state of Israel has brought about this friction that you're seeing today. It is important to understand that Israel has, that the cleavage between secular Israelis and religious Israelis has been one of the number one cleavages in Israeli political society from the get-go. But over the past few years, we've seen this growth play out within the political parties. The other part of the differences between the left and the right, such as it is inside of Israel, is of course the conversation about the disputed lands, or the areas that, as far as, what is considered beyond the Green Line, Judea and Samaria, whatever you call the political, the lines beyond the 67 borders. I mean, these are all part of the conversation that play into the political discourse. And so the right is for increasing and expanding growth of land, settlement expansion and whatnot. The left, again, such as it is, it's not that it is opposed to it. I would say that it's much more tempered in its policies when it comes to that conversation. And as far as leaving a potential door open to conversations with the Palestinians. Netanyahu, again, also to be clear on that note itself, Netanyahu has never said that he has closed the door to Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. It's a matter of coming down to sit down at the negotiation table. For the past 23 years, there has not been direct negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians. And that has, independent of Netanyahu. I mean, again, Netanyahu has been used as a, whether or not, people don't like Netanyahu or love Netanyahu, any Israeli leadership government, in general, has been accused of thwarting or not allowing for these negotiations to happen. That's been a consistent messaging coming out of the Palestinian Authority one way or another. So again, not unique to Benjamin Netanyahu. So by the time we get to 2022, and this was, the latest kind of hurrah of where we are now. Netanyahu was able to come, and he really did, was able to create this coalition that gets him to 64 seats. And the 64 seats is a much stable government with the religious right. The problem has been, as I alluded to before, is the negotiation, the bartering that is played out here as far as a political game of chicken, as well as trying to squeeze Netanyahu as much as they can to get the most coveted portfolios in the Israeli government. Netanyahu sits on the largest amount, again, within the 30 seats, so he's been able to give out the larger portfolios vis-a-vis the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Defense, and whatnot. However, these smaller parties that need, Netanyahu needs them in order to maintain this majority and the stability, have been squeezing him to get these portfolios that they've been negotiating for. And so what is equivalent today to Israeli Homeland Security sits within the religious parties. That has created a significant amount of friction between the police and the army in Israel because of the fact that the individuals who are sitting on those portfolios, namely Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who are on the hard right of Israeli society, have no military background whatsoever. They are political appointees as a result of being in the government. And so you're seeing that friction play out here as a result of their ability and their know-how to even deal with some of these matters. And over the past few weeks since this government has been elected, we've also seen a significant rise of domestic terrorism that has been taking place inside of Israel from Palestinians attacking. And so the visuals that we're seeing now are reminiscent of visuals of attacks that we saw back in 2000, when we're seeing Palestinian terrorism increasing, attacking Jews and whatnot. All of that is once again, on the one hand, it's testing the Israeli government as to what it's going to do, and that has historically been a way things have been done by the Islamist movements within the Palestinian circles, groups like Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and others. And on the other hand, to see, from the Israeli population side, how the state of Israel is going to react. How much is Netanyahu going to be able to be pushed without reacting? And this is all part of the game that's playing out here as part of these latest elections. We can't, not talk about the fact that there is currently a significant amount, going back to my point about the tension between secular Israelis and religious Israelis, is that given the political environment and the political changes that the Netanyahu coalition is proposing, there has been a significant amount of protest inside of Israel as a result of that, and namely coming out of the secular segment of Israeli society, given what Netanyahu is proposing as far as judicial reforms inside of Israel. These are, again, domestic issues, but they play into the Israeli, for lack of a better term, electorate, of how and why they vote for these individuals. And that's going to be an ongoing problem going forward, I would say, until this is resolved. At this point, to date, as of the last few hours, the current president of the state of Israel, who is a figurehead. The president doesn't have any executive duties, with the exception of inaugurating and codifying a government, which he has been forced to do now several times. Given what we've seen now with the cycle of elections, and when it comes to these kind of compromises that are playing out, that are really hurting the societal stability of the state of Israel. So that's what you're seeing play out here in general at this current to date issue. I will say, that again, it is abnormal and bizarre, of course, that we've seen so many elections in such a short amount of time. It does not help the stability of the state of Israel, does not help the Israeli economy from a budgetary process and its ability to get things done. The last government was headed by, before this government was dissolved, was headed by Naftali Bennett. Again, somebody who was an individual who used to be close to Benjamin Netanyahu, broke off, started a fringe party, and was able to become, talk about Israeli, politics. I said before that it's a proportional representation when it comes to the Israeli parliament. Bennett only had 6 seats and still was able, through the coalition configuration and the kind of the political gaming that played out here, was still able to become prime minister. And he was there for a year. Again, a very diverse government they was able to put together. And so it showed Israelis that, what can happen, what cannot happen with a different individual, given the kind of permanence of the fixture when it comes to an individual like Benjamin Netanyahu. I think that all leaders need to know when to say goodbye. It was, I think that it was Eisenhower who knew, when he needed to go get a farm in Gettysburg and to change his, when to, change his tune and to retire. There is a power struggle here about trying to maintain that power struggle that Netanyahu has been able to capitalize on, but also capitalize on a sentiment in Israeli society. From a political, I would say, as an historian, I mean, the founding fathers of those who helped create the state of Israel, the big leaders as far as going back to the days of David Ben-Gurion and Shimon Peres, who was a former prime minister, and Ariel Sharon, that generation of Yitzhak Rabin, of pre-48, going up all the way to 67 and beyond, is no longer around. And so Israel is also going through this internal kind of tension of leadership. Benjamin Netanyahu represents kind of a last thread of, not because his family comes from the founding fathers, again, the story of his brother being the sole victim of Entebbe back in 1976 is part of Netanyahu's legacy and something he talks about a lot as far as his political MO, and even as a catalyst to pushing him into politics. And so there is that pedigree that Netanyahu comes from. It's harder and harder to see the younger generation coming about, carrying the same kind of pedigree that Netanyahu still has. And so that sentiment is also somewhat convincing and something that Israelis are able to get behind, for better or for worse. But I will say that the concerns now are really sweeping a significant change in Israeli society as to the stability of the government itself. Netanyahu is currently proposing significant judicial reforms to the state of Israel. Again, not to get too much into the weeds of how the Israeli system works as far as the branches of power, but the judiciary in Israel has aggregated over the past 40 years more power than any other branch. The lack of separation of checks and balances between the branches, and so part of these problems are problems that have been going on for the past 40 plus years. Nothing new here. The fact that Benjamin Netanyahu, as the current prime minister, and as someone who's had his own legal issues to deal with inside of Israel, that he's being charged with different accounts, and coupled with the fact that he has these religious parties working with him, has created a significant outburst of concern within, especially the Israeli secular population. And so there has been now for the past, I would say, over a month and a half now, if not more, ongoing protests, weekly protests inside of Israel, of people who feel threatened by these potential reforms. Personally, I think that these reforms are indeed important, but again, the way they're being executed is a whole other bag of issues and they are causing concern all around. It's also important to note that part of the problem that you're seeing structurally in Israel that is affording these liberties to take place in the political system is a lack of a constitution. Israel has basic laws. Israel has no constitution. The weight of the basic laws in Israel has the weight of some constitutional laws, and there is a fundamental question about whether or not some of them can be overturned and what majority. These are the issues that drive the Israeli voter and are concerning to the stability of the state of Israel. And it's a growing concern. I mean, I don't have, as an historian, I never predict the future, ever. but these patterns that we've been seeing, these cycle of patterns, which are been illustrated by the cycle of elections, are troublesome. And they are not good for the Israeli democracy. And again, when I say the word democracy, I know we have to put aside our own view of the American democracy. The Israeli democracy, I would say, is more similar to that of Italy or Albania, for that matter. The Israeli parliament is more similar to the British parliament. And so take that with a grain of salt as far as how we look at different kinds of democracies. There are many democratic elements and they support the idea of the spirit of democracy. However, there are challenges that play out here. These patterns are not helpful to the Israeli stability. Furthermore, the fact that because the threshold that I mentioned before is so small, the idea of a 3.25% of a small party coming in, anybody who feels slighted or, and feels that, he or she is not going to be accepted or doesn't like the majority viewpoint will go immediately to a non-confidence vote, and they could dismantle this entire architecture, which is what we've seen happen since 2018. That every time because what happens is, and this is this game of political football, and maybe Israelis should follow more American football to understand how this works, is the fact that every time that these coalitions are, they are ideologically are able to work together on some things, but they are not able to follow through. Netanyahu has been able to create a solidified percentage of power, but in the past few years, he was going back to the individuals here. He has stabbed each one of these leaders in the back by trying to, by the potential when there was political back and forth. Both Lapid and Gantz. Gantz was supposed to be in a rotation government to rotate the premiership with Netanyahu. That never came to fruition because Netanyahu pulled the plug on that. Netanyahu was able to himself become the prime minister, but then when it came to Gantz's turn, he pulled the plug. And so all of these individuals have political vendettas against Benjamin Netanyahu. And so this is the game that plays out here. So the idea that these governments attempt to last 4 years is become more of a wishful a kind of thinking that is actual practical. And so that's the political back and forth that we're seeing here and the political game of chicken that I see going forward. The only interesting part that could happen to try to solve this problem is at any point in time where the two largest political parties, going back to the original slide that I had here, hypothetically, if a Likud and a Yesh Atid, these two parties themselves, could agree because of finding issues where they could agree upon, and some issues where they have some kind of synchronized matters that work well for them when it comes to security and issues of the economy, then you could have a much more stable government. That has not happened. By the way, these rotation governments where the Labor and Likud have been come together since the 1980s. And there was a stable government between Yitzhak Shamir and Shimon Peres back in the 1980s, where they rotated 2 years on, 2 years off. And because the two parties agreed that for the greater good of the state of Israel, they were able to sit together and taking away the power and the bargaining power of these smaller parties. Because there's so much animosity, which is more to do these days between the characters of the leaders of the parties themselves than the parties where they could find ideological, political common ground. That's where you're seeing the friction play out here. So that's, in a nutshell, a lot of what we're seeing here. So, Lo, what do you think? As I've covered, our little C-SPAN of conversation.
Fabulous. Could I also So there's been so much discussion about the relationship between the Netanyahu government being a little bit more religious and right-wing with Jewish Americans, and then also with Biden. Tom Friedman had a nice article in the New York Times the other day about Biden being a little critical of these judicial reforms. So, how is Israeli-U.S. relations?
Well, that's a hot button issue. The American Jewish community today is fragmented. It's always been fragmented, and the friction is definitely bleeding into Israeli politics and how one sees all of this. The debate today in America, I would say, has to do with the debate about Jewish identity. And historically speaking, Israel used to be a core component of Jewish identity. And today, as a result of not only the current government, but there's been policies about, that they don't like or do like or whatnot, there's been a movement and a shift away from Israel. And part of this is also clouded by our own American politics as far as liberal progressive politics and how they see Israel fit into that box as Jews. And so that has played into the debate about, case in point, the fact that these religious parties, and when I talk about religious parties, it's important to note to your question, these are Orthodox parties. The Orthodox parties, when you're talking about the fact that the majority of the American Jewish community, is divided into two parts, either Orthodox or Reform. The Reform sector of that leans left, and so the fact that they are seeing a lack of openness and pluralism inside of Israel as it relates to the way they practice Judaism has become a sticking point for them. It's always been a sticking point, by the way. I will also say that the question, because the religious authorities in Israel control conversion, and the fact that so they do not accept reform or conservative or reconstructionist conversion on their terms. There have been different attempts for compromises over the years and attempts to include conservative and reform rabbis in those commissions. However, the Orthodox, they dominate and dictate how things are going to play out. These are friction issues. The other part, which has to do with kind of national security matters, has to do with the question of the Israeli-Palestinian peace track, or lack thereof for that matter. And so these issues have also played into the conversation in general. And the third, again, not necessarily in the order of importance, is the significant growing rise of global anti-Semitism, which we are seeing, growing like wildfire. And the question of what anti-Semitism is, and the hatred, there has been an attempt to try to carve out the Israel component, of the fact that, well, I don't like you because I don't like the policies of Netanyahu as far as Israel, versus hatred of Jews in its totality included under the umbrella of anti-Semitism. Those are also friction points. And so when you have individuals that are, we lobby our politicians here, and Netanyahu talks a great deal about the fact that he has known President Biden for over 40 years, and the fact that they don't agree on many things, but they know each other. That is a difference, in contrast to the Obama administration, where there was open hate between the two leaders. I would say one of the cardinal rules when it comes to U.S.-American relations is what is known as the no daylight rule. And the fact that has to do with the fact that you don't air the dirty laundry in public the way that the animosity between Obama and Netanyahu. They hated each other, and they were not shy about it. It leaked to social media. And so there was a lot of feeling of stabbing one another in the back. And so we have, from a Netanyahu viewpoint, he has a potential ally who he's known in the White House for 40 years. And so he believes there can be conversations. Whether or not they will agree, disagree, at least there can be some kind of solid conversation in general on these matters. I think that the growth of the amount of terrorism that you're seeing now and the protests in Israel, the stability, these are all concerns that the government, that the White House currently has in looking at the region and its stability, and they're bringing it up. And I think that is, these are major issues that are not, but I think that there is, because if you poll most American Jews, they tend to lean more left, and the perception that Netanyahu is hard right, that is also playing into parachuting a perspective of viewing American politics on Israeli Middle East politics. And I would say that that's where the lost in translation takes place. As I said in my earlier remarks, the gap between left and right inside of Israel is much narrower than the gap between left and right here, and that is significant. That's a significant point to understand, because if you took out all of these, the heads of these parties, the individuals, you would find much more common ground.
I know as a historian you don't like to predict the future, but anyway, I'll ask you to bring out your crystal ball.
Yeah.
How stable is the Netanyahu government? He's got a little bit more of a cushion. To my uninformed view, it's pretty marginal.
It is marginal, but all these governments are marginal. I mean, they are not, they're not stable at all. I mean, that's, on average, a 4-year government does not go more than 30 months. I mean, that's been part of the problem. I mean, again, in the constellation of Middle East democracies, or not many, for that matter, and if you're talking about dictatorships, comparing Israel to what you're seeing happen when it comes to places like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and whatnot, the spirit of democracy is there. There are foundational elements of democracy found in the Israeli democracy. It's what it lacks that makes it challenging. Lack of a constitution, lack of a separation of synagogue, church, and state. I mean, these are challenges, to the Israeli democracy itself. How it works, I mean, this is the miracle of the state of Israel. I mean, the fact that it's able to govern itself for the past 75 years and do these things. Well, I will say, all joking aside, that when it comes to the big picture, existential matters, security, and especially security. When it comes to defending the sanctity of the state of Israel's existence as it relates to threats coming in from Iran or from terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, they're all on the same page. That, this is the kind of the twisted irony of how the state of Israel operates. When it comes to times of crisis, they are able to unite and work together. Now, how do you take that element and that glue and also trickle that down into day-to-day Israeli life? That's the challenge. I mean, you're talking about, Israeli follow politics like we follow sports. You will get an entire political manifesto in a cab ride wherever you want to go, and they will tell you how and why they voted. I mean, Israelis, no joke. I mean, the Netanyahu base is in the Israeli bazaar, in the market. The vendors, they're the ones he's been able to galvanize and tell them vote for me, and they say yes. He was able to galvanize the periphery. He's been able to galvanize because they see Netanyahu as the way they saw Menachem Begin back in 1977. That was Menachem Begin's biggest attraction, that he was able to bring all parts of Israeli society together, and especially the Sephardic communities inside of Israel from the periphery, all to vote for Menachem Begin. And so Netanyahu has tried to replicate that by saying, we are the People's Party. And so, that's where he goes to every open market to kind of say, vote for me. And they have, it worked. I mean, as I said, the math works out for Netanyahu, but they come up with the same results, and they're stuck on this 28 to 30 seat. And because they can't go beyond that, they constantly come out with the same, as we know, the old definition of insanity. I mean, this is the kind of thing that they keep on doing, this experiment. What's going to be the changing factor is, once you remove Netanyahu, what's the next step? Is there going to be, what's next after this? I mean, because this is not, this can't go in perpetuity. And at some point, he's going to have to find maybe not a farm in Gettysburg, but, somewhere else to go to. And you're going to have to figure out, that's going to be the biggest change factor to all of this. The people who've tried to dethrone Netanyahu have been unsuccessful within his own party and have gone on to similar parties that are aligned, like kind of expats of the Likud, the blue and white, and other places, and say we can work within those parties, but let's wait until Netanyahu's day is done. And that's going to be a major factor. And that's going to change the numbers. Then you're going to be able to test and see how they play out as far as the party versus the leader of the party. Yeah, Dave.
Iran, for decades, Iran has been described, and accurately so, as an existential threat to Israel. They have said they want to wipe Israel off the map, and they've been acquiring the means to do so. Where would you say we are in that milieu? Is Iran still getting closer? Are they in neutral right now, stuck? Are things being pushed back a little bit because of
Ukraine?
Economic policies or other things? I mean, are we getting closer to a conflict, staying the same?
No, Iran is consistently, they are singularly focused on their agenda. They have not stopped their operations. And I think that, so the threat is continuous. Which is exactly, again, going back to why Netanyahu has been successful. Netanyahu has been advocating for taking out Iran, disarming the Iranian nuclear threat for the past 20 years. And so he's been selling that message to the White House and to the world leaders wherever he goes. And he's been true about that. So what he's done, the one thing that Israel has taken openly, they admitted that it was their responsibility was when they gathered all the intel, and that's when he brought all the intel, and showed it on live TV, and he had all the footage and whatnot. The blueprints are all there, and so the threat has not subsided. What you are seeing that has kind of overshadowed some of this is, of course, Ukraine, the recent tragedy in Turkey and Syria. There's a lot of world events that are continuously playing out here that are allowing the Iranians to continue with their messaging. And so, and economically speaking, when it comes to the Iranian front, so long as the Belt and Road is continuing as far as China and as far as Russia, who are continuing to buy from the Iranians, our sanctions are not that biting. And yes, it would create a huge influx of cash. And I would say that last time this happened, back when the JCPOA, when they moved along back in 2015, the beneficiaries of that were, of course, Hezbollah and Hamas, and so who did not have nuclear capability. And so those are also threats, but the threat continues. And so the fact that we are not focusing on that allows them to continue their mission. That's where, again, Israel has been consistent. And so all parties agree. I mean, if you poll the majority of Israeli society today, that's the one single issue they will agree upon. They will not agree on anything else, but that seems to be the one, because to them, the threat is alive and well. They know that the capabilities that Hezbollah has, the capability, the increased capabilities that Hamas has coming out of Gaza has Iranian footprints on it. And so it's very clear to them about what that means. And so that's the glue. And I don't see that changing unless there's going to be some kind, I mean, again, apropos diplomatic changes, where I do see a potential change is, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that now Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to work on normalizing relations with the Saudis, Saudis being the defenders and the number one defenders of Sunni Islam and defenders of Mecca. They see Iran as a threat to Mecca. This is where he could potentially get some movement when it comes to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have a mutual respect for the Israelis on the military front, and that also allows this configuration to work.
Israel doesn't want Russia to curtail their actions within Syria. And we would like to push Israel a little bit to be more supportive of Ukraine.
Yeah.
More is involved in all of that.
No, it's an interesting point. I mean, over dinner, you and I were talking. One of the critical points that came up in the first interview Netanyahu gave after these recent elections was to CNN when the State Department was in Israel, when Blinken and Sullivan and whatnot, and Jake Tapper posed a question to him about the fact about whether or not Netanyahu was asked by world leaders to be a broker when it comes to the Ukraine. Kind of avoided and tiptoed around the question. And to be fair, he said that, he'd be considered doing it because he knows both leaders and he can work with them, et cetera. But does he want to be put in that position? Is really the concern. So Ukraine represents a kind of a catch-22 for the Israelis. And that is to say that there have been many Jews from Ukraine who've come to Israel as a result. Israel has given given assistance when it comes to aid and the kind of devastation and those are the kind of things that Israel has done. Militarily, it's been a kind of a challenge, and the challenge has been is the relationship between Jerusalem and Moscow, and Putin has been on message. And Putin has been trying to create a kind of a Cold War 2.0, and he's been, basically going around to all of these countries in the Gulf and the Arab world saying, do you want me or do you want somebody who's crazier than me? Or, is basically, the message that he's been. And so, and he's been on message. And furthermore, he's been on message because the message that's been coming out of the White House has not been consistent. And so, for example, when Gaddafi, in Libya, the Syrian red lines that came out of Kerry and the Obama administration, all these empty threats, the message was, the evil you know versus the evil you don't know. Putin has been consistent. And so the relationship between the Russians and the Israelis has been as such. They don't agree because Russia has basically one base in Lakia, in Syria, and the crux of Syria, the backbone of Syria is based on three cities: Aleppo, Homs, and Damascus. Once one of them falls, as we saw with the civil war, the entire country collapses. Putin believes that he runs that country. And in essence, when he said the civil war was over, and he'll tell the way things are done. He does not agree with Israel that Iran is a terrorist-sponsored state. What he does agree with Israel is the fact that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. So what has happened over the past few years is that the Israelis have given the Russians enough intel to make sure that the conflict in Syria does not bleed into Israel. Furthermore, every time when Israel took out the nuclear reactor back in 2007, and in Syria, and when Israel has done these surgical attacks there's been no retaliation. I mean, yes, you'll see on social media in Arabic and English, acts of war coming out of the Assad regime. They don't have the capability to do that without the support of the Iranians and the Russians. And so in the old days, when Assad Sr. was in power, of course, it would all be Russian munitions. The difference is today is that in the old days they would give it for free. Now they got to buy it, and so the price of how much their economy can afford to buy and the cost of the ruble to make all of this happen. But so Israel has a foreign policy that works well with Moscow, in the sense that you have Soviet, Jewish expats and whatnot, and how this plays out. And so they are, they've been able to work within all of that. And by the way, when the Ukraine war began, you saw all these Jewish gazillionaires from Ukraine who are landing their private jets inside of Israel. And so again, so there's also the economic part of all of this, where all this is coming out. And so that's what's been playing out here. So again, this all relates to this puzzle when it comes to Iran, and it comes to Syria, and it comes to Lebanon, who are unstable, in those regard. And Russia has been a stabilizing force here. And so you take an individual like Netanyahu, who's been able to negotiate with these leaders and to deal with their personalities, whether he would be somebody who could negotiate and broker a peace. The Russians respond to the kind of the mentality of what we call in the Arab world the strong horse. And so the idea is that Netanyahu is seen as a strong horse. In the Russian narrative, he's a survivor. I mean, the guy's a magician. I mean, he's been able to be the longest standing prime minister Israel has ever had. And no matter what is thrown at Netanyahu, he still is on top. Because at the end of the day, he's still the prime minister. And by the way, tongue in cheek, that was the message that he told Obama.
Well, with that, we should thank you. Thank you, Asaf, for being here.
My pleasure.